Hi there. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Monica Ahmed, Senior Communications Advisor at our PRA. Thank you so much for joining us today for a proposed 2024 fees consultation on tires, batteries, ITT AV, and lighting programs. The webinar today will provide information about the consultation process, the proposed fees, as well as answer your questions. So just really quickly want to point something out. So if you'd like to ask a question during the webinar, you can just click on the Q&A tab that's at the bottom of your screen. Type in your question or comment and click send. There's also an upvote feature where you can like another person's comment or question, and this will just move the comment or question up the queue and prompt us to answer it quicker. We'll also have some time during the webinar to answer these questions. If for any reason we can't get to your question because of time, or if your question is very specific, please feel free to reach out to our team at consultations@rpra.ca, and they'll be happy to help. Again, that email address is consultations@rpra.ca, and in case you missed it, it'll also be later on in the slide deck. And speaking of the slide deck, we'll be sharing it with you via email at the end of the webinar period, or sorry, once we're finished all the webinars. We're also recording today's session, and we'll be posting that to our website later this week as well. So with that, I'll go ahead and hand it over to Noah Getterman, who's our PRA's General Counsel and Chief of Strategic Initiatives. Noah, take it away.
Thanks, Monica. Let's get started. So we always begin these presentations just with a reminder of who the RPRA is and what we do. Probably throughout this presentation, I'll start saying RIPRA instead of RPRA. RIPRA is a regulator, provincial regulator, and we're mandated by the government of Ontario to do two major activities. One of them is to provide digital registration and reporting services to Ministry of Environment programs, and right now that's excess soil and hazardous waste. And the other thing we do is related to the transition to a circular economy. And there's two components of that. The first is winding up legacy waste diversion programs under the old under the Waste Diversion Transition Act. And then, of course, implementing new resource recovery legislation through a new producer responsibility framework under the RRCEA and its associated regulations. We are an administrative authority, and what that means is that, at least in this case, we do not receive any government funding. So all of our operations are funded through the fees that we charge to our registrants on always on a cost recovery basis. And so the proposal for fees we have out now is for all of our program fees, I believe, except for excess soil. Today we're focused, in this webinar, we're focused on tires, batteries, and ITT AV and lighting programs. We, just like last year, we're proposing fees in advance of the calendar year that they'll apply to. So we're proposing a fee schedule, consulting on it now, and the plan is for those fees to be approved for the 2024 reporting season for your programs. Our fees are based on our 2024 budget, which has been approved by our board, and we'll go through some budget information soon, and there will be more detail in our business plan, which should be posted to our website very soon, and you will get a notification about that as soon as it's posted. Next slide, please. A bit more background about fees and where RIPRA's revenue comes from. So there's three sources. One source is the registrants that participate or that use our digital reporting services for excess oil and hazardous waste. The other source is monthly charges to the industry funding organizations that are being wound up under the WDTA. And the third source of revenues is our producers under the producer responsibility programs. And that includes obviously the programs we're talking about today. Next slide, please. Our process for consultation is very similar to what we did last year. We're obligated under our governing statute to consult on proposed fees for 45 days. And then once they're approved by our board, we need to post them for 30 days on our website before they take effect. This consultation started on October 2nd and will run to November 16th. So you can share feedback at the email address on the slide. We appreciate, you can share feedback up to November 16th, but we appreciate it as early as possible. That helps us prepare that feedback for our board, who makes the final decision on fees. We posted our proposal, which you know already, on our website, and we're hosting some webinars throughout the consultation period. Obviously, this is one of them. There will be another one for Blue Box and HSP producers, I think later this week. There's some materials already posted to our website about the consultation. Once these webinars are concluded, there also the recordings are posted to our website along with the presentation materials. And when fees are finally approved by our board, you will get notified of the final fee schedule. Again, those get posted on our website, and we also post a consultation report, which summarizes the feedback we received. If you want to see what that looks like, you can go on our website to see consultations from previous years, including last year, and how we summarize feedback and respond to it in our consultation report. And there's more information about all of this on our website. Next slide, please. So the next little bit, I'm going to try to walk through and provide a bit more detail on how we set fees. We have a general fee setting policy that's on our website. There's a link here. So once this presentation is posted, you'll be able to link right to it. That policy sets out a little bit about what our fee setting process is, and also a number of principles that guide our fee setting process. And with that kind of overarching guidance, we have 5 main components to the fee setting process listed here. So the first, our starting point, is the annual budget. So the board sets our budget every year through an annual business planning process. That budget for 2024 was approved at the end of September. Again, it will be, it's incorporated into our business plan and will get posted on our website soon. That's done. That process takes place over the summer. Obviously that annual budget is our starting point for the costs we need to recover from our registrants for the upcoming year. Once we have the overall RIPRA budget. The next input is our cost allocation methodology, and that's how we take our overall budget and allocate costs to each of the programs that we run. And an important point here is that we operate, a lot of what we do is run on a shared services model. And so our cost allocation methodology helps ensure that we're allocating costs to the programs that are using the resources. The third input, once we've allocated our budget or our cost recovery targets to each of the programs, is an adjustment for previous year deficits or surpluses. So each year, our expenses for the year may be higher or lower than what we predicted, and our revenues for each program may be higher or lower than what we predicted. So those pluses and minuses stay with the program and get wrapped up into future year fees. So because we set fees, we'll talk a little bit more about this later on, because we set fees before the end of the year, we're usually incorporating, not always, but usually incorporating deficits or surpluses 2 years out. But again, those stay with the program. So once we have a cost allocation for the program, we incorporate any deficits or surpluses related to that program from previous years. And that total cost recovery target then in step 4 gets run through our fee model. And later on, we'll talk about the fee model we use and we're proposing to use again for our producer responsibility programs. And then the final input as part of that fee model are estimates we make about the amount of material being supplied, in this case by producers for each of the programs, because we set fees on a per unit or per kilogram basis. The volume of material supplied is really the final input into the fee rate that we propose. So I'm going to walk through each of these again in a little bit more detail before getting to the fee rates. Next slide, please. And so on the next slide, we've got tables summarizing. Oh, before we get to the table summarizing our budget, I think it's important to stop just for a moment on our strategic priorities. So these priorities really guide our activities for the year. They were updated for the first time in a while for 2023. In 2024, we're proposing that they will be the same as they are in 2023. This really summarizes what our focus is as an organization for the year. Number one, providing registrants with accessible and easy to use registry services. So all of the programs we run rely on our registry, which is a key component of the reporting, tracking, and verification we do, and a key component of how registrants communicate to us. Number two is delivering an effective compliance program. So for our producer responsibility programs, not for our digital reporting services, but our producer responsibility programs, we are the regulator mandated to enforce the obligations under those regulations. And so that's obviously a big part of where our focus is in order to achieve program outcomes and a level playing field for participants for the regulated community. Number three is providing the province with reliable and useful resource and waste information. So a big part of what we do, or a big part of our mandate, is to report publicly on registry data and performance outcomes of the programs that we run. And then finally, our fourth priority is focused on ensuring that we remain accountable to the government and our stakeholders, and that we operate in a transparent way and in a sustainable way over the long term. So I just wanted to pause there and just review a little bit sort of what our strategic priorities are for 2024, and those really drive where our resources are going to in 2024. Next slide, please. So here's the overview of our 2024 budget, and that's in the rightmost column on the slide. The other two columns show a comparison to our 2023 budget and to what we forecasted in 2023 for 2024. So our 2023 business plan was published in October of 2022, and we added a forecast for 2024 in there, and that's that middle column comparison you see. So our budget, now our approved budget for 2024, is on track to our forecast. There are some pluses and minuses in each of the lines. So in particular, the salaries and benefits is higher than forecast, and our registry and IT expenses are higher than forecast. That is because of additional investments we're making in registry customer support and IT support to make sure we're providing the best service we can for our producer responsibility programs and our digital reporting services. Those increases are offset by decreases in other lines, including professional fees and amortization. Amortization will come up again in this presentation, but that relates to the amounts we pay every year for the registry builds that we did. So when we build our registries for each of our programs, the capital cost of that gets amortized over 10 years. And so it's paid off over a 10-year period. And so that amortization line is the total amount for all our programs there. You'll see more detail about the amortization amount for individual programs later on. Next slide, please. This is just another view of the 2024 budget divided up into those three sources of fees that I talked about earlier. So we have our producer responsibility programs and the total budget or cost recovery target for those programs. We have our digital reporting service programs, and you see the total amount for here titled EPA programs, but those are our digital reporting service programs for excess oil and hazardous waste, total budget for those. And then our legacy WDTA programs, and you see the total budget there for those programs. Next slide, please. So that's if you go back to sort of or think back to the 5 inputs to the process, that was an overview of our budget. So that's number 1. Next step or next component is our cost allocation methodology. So this is how we take those overall budget figures and allocate those costs to the programs that are drawing the resources. So the first step in that process, that allocation process, is assigning direct costs to each of the programs. So the biggest component of direct costs are registry amortization and the interest on that amortization. So again, the cost to build each program's registry is a direct cost to that program, and the interest on those amounts is a direct cost to that program. There's also each program takes on a component or an equal amount of our registry foundational costs. But the biggest part of direct costs is this registry amount. Some programs have other specific direct costs relating to specific program initiatives, but the biggest piece is the registry. The next one is our common costs. And again, I talked about how we operate on a shared service model. So our indirect costs, like general administration costs, that is allocated across all of our programs using a program weight approach based on an estimate of how much of our resources that program typically draws. But most of our services are volume-based and driven in particular by the number of registrants in the program. And so that's a lot of our registry support staff, our compliance staff, our IT services. And those costs are, again, they're shared costs. So we typically don't have, or I should say our support officers, for example, our compliance officers, our IT folks are typically not assigned to specific programs. In order to be as efficient as we can, those staff and supports are shared across programs. And so we use cost drivers, and in particular, the number of registrants in a program to make sure that we're allocating costs to the programs that are sort of taking the resources. One change for 2024 is that a greater proportion, or I should say a greater portion of our budget is now being allocated using these volume-based cost drivers. And we made that change to ensure we're aligning allocations, cost allocations with where the activity is in the best way that we can. The last two parts of the methodology are less impactful in terms of total amount. The third one is the contribution that each program makes to our operating reserve. So we maintain an operating reserve at RIPRA. Our operating agreement with the ministry caps that at a maximum of 50% of our annual budget. Our target right now is to get it to 40% of our annual budget. That's a reserve amount that we do use throughout the year to help manage our cash flows, and is important for us to maintain to ensure sustainability over the long term. And so there's an amount that each program contributes to that reserve until we get to our 40% target. Final amount is a contribution each program makes to recover startup costs from when RIPRA was first created, but before we were able to start charging fees. So that's relatively smaller amount, but is also allocated out equally to each RIPRA program. Next slide, please. After we implement that methodology, the output or a summary of the output is shown on this slide. So this shows the proposed 2024 program cost allocations for all of our programs. You see tires, batteries, and ITT-AV and lighting highlighted. The tires amount, or the year-over-year change in the tires allocation, is consistent with our overall budget increase of around 4%. So as the budget has gone up, tires is sort of just sharing in an equal portion of that. For batteries and ITT-AV, there is a decrease in the amount allocated. And that's for two reasons. One is a small reduction in direct costs to that program, and also because of a decrease in the number of registrants in that program. And because registrants drives our cost drivers and where we see resources going, which programs we see resources going to, that's resulted in a reduction in the allocation of batteries and ITT-AV. And then finally, for lighting, also we see a substantial reduction in the costs being allocated to lighting for the year in 2024. And again, that's because of a decrease in the number of registrants that we expected in the program. And we'll get into that a bit more later on. But because the number of registrants are lower, we're allocating fewer costs to that program, which results in a year-over-year decline in the allocated costs. So that's not the total recovery yet. So I think on the next slide, I was going to say our total cost recovery will incorporate surpluses and deficits, so we'll get to that in a bit. We wanted to pause on this slide just to give a picture of over time the allocations to each of our programs as a percentage of RIPRA's total budget. So the total amount that a program gets allocated for many of our programs, not all of them, but for many of them, has declined over time. And that's in part because of the shared services model we run. So because of efficiencies, both in terms of how we run our registry and how we do customer support, costs can be shared across a bigger number of registrants. And as we have added programs, the share of costs allocated to many of the programs has declined over time. And so we just thought this would just be a helpful historical view that is otherwise hard to draw out of the business plan and annual report material on our website. Next slide, please. Here's a more detailed view of the cost allocation for each program. I'm gonna maybe just I'll probably go through this quickly because it will come up again, and you'll see a different view for each program that compares it to 2023. But here we just see the major sources of costs for each program. Again, the amortization line I talked about as being related to development costs for the registries, which are amortized over 10 years. There's interest costs related to that debt, the financing for that debt. Some direct costs. So there is an amount for tires. I believe that relates to additional development of registry procedures. And when we do registry procedure work, that is sometimes allocated directly to the program that the procedure relates to. The common costs, that's our indirect general admin costs plus the portion of the shared services. And then the last line is the combination of the reserve contribution plus the repayment of RIPRA startup costs from when RIPRA was first created. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, once we have the allocation to each program using our cost allocation methodology, we get to component or input number 3, which are surpluses and deficits. So these get assessed at the end of each year, looking at whether revenue from the program was in fact more or less than what we predicted, and looking also at what actual expenses were. Those deficits or surpluses from the end of the year are typically carried through and applied to each program 2 years after that surplus or deficit is incurred. And that's because we set fees before the end of the year, right? So if there are deficits or surpluses for 2023, those are typically carried through, those would typically be carried through to the 2025, excuse me, the 2025 fees. The deficits and surpluses we're looking at for 2024 relate to the 2022 calendar year. So I think we might as well go to the next slide. So this is a view into the prior year surplus or deficit for each program. So for tires, there is a small surplus from 2022. So that's added to the 24 cost allocation amount to get a total cost recovery in 2024. That's that middle column there. And we do just show a comparison to 2023. So the total year-over-year program cost recovery target change for tires is a 2% increase. For batteries and ITT AV, I think we saw before, if I'm remembering correctly, a 9% reduction in the cost allocation year over year. There is also a substantial surplus from 2022. And so that amount gets added to or offset, is used to offset the cost allocation to get a total cost recovery for 2024. And when we combine those two, it's an overall decrease year over year of 20% in the amount that we're targeting to recover. And then for lighting, we did see that there was a substantial reduction in the cost, 2024 cost allocation compared to 2023. There is also a substantial deficit left over from 2022 because volumes or revenues were less than what we expected, because the supply volumes being reported were less than what we expected. And so when that gets added on, the total cost recovery target ends up being about 3% less than 2023 year over year. And that the difference between the big reduction in the cost allocation, but a smaller year over year decrease is just that deficit from 2022. And so important to keep in mind that these the year-over-year changes shown on the last column there, those aren't the changes in your fee rates, because we still need to input these numbers into our fee model and then our estimates for 2024 supply volumes. So those aren't the fee rate changes, but those are the changes in total costs that we're trying to recover from producers in those programs. Next slide, please. Oh, so now we get a pause for questions. So there's a lot of material. I think, again, just as a high-level summary, we've gone through our budget, cost allocation methodology, our surplus deficit adjustments. So coming up, we'll look briefly at the fee model, and then for each of the three programs, our volume estimates and what the fee rates actually come out to.
Great, thanks, Noah. So we just have one question in the queue so far, so shouldn't be a very long Q&A period, but just a reminder to everyone else, if you have any other questions, please send them in. We will have another chance to answer questions at the end of the webinar. We just got another question in about the deck. I'll address that in just a second. Carol, just going to read out the first question for you here, Noah. How are free riders, also known as non-compliant obligated producers, addressed with fee setting? Compliant producers' fee rate should not include budgeting for RPRA activities related to free riders. How is this addressed?
Right. So that's a good question. When we bring free riders in or enforce compliance against free riders, they're typically then required to pay us the fees that they owe us. And so when that happens, those amounts get incorporated into our budget, just like other revenues. We are a cost recovery organization, so we need to set fees in a way that tries to minimize deficits year over year. And so in our estimates, we do take into account what we the volume and the supply we expect to see. And we try to be as accurate as we can in assessing or estimating the supply volume we should be receiving in the year. And so that will account for all of the supply that we think is out there, and that should be reported into RIPRA. And then if there are folks who don't report, or are free riders who aren't reporting when they are caught and brought in, they will have to make the contributions that they owe. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. So just really quickly, if we have questions on this slide deck, who do we reach out to? So just a quick reminder to everyone, you can reach us at consultations@rpra.ca. So feel free to send your questions that way. If the question is just about where you can find the slide deck, it'll be posted onto our website later this week, most likely by tomorrow, but if not by the end of the week. And we also have consultation materials about this, as well as the other fees consultations on our website, as well as Noah mentioned. So happy to share that. Actually, I'll go ahead and send the link to answer that question there for you, Carol, in case you want to go check it out.
Yeah, and Monica, maybe I'll just add, so I talked earlier about feedback on our proposal, and you can use that consultations@ripra.ca email, but just to emphasize again, if you have questions about the proposal, you can also submit those to the same email. And we will definitely try to get back to you during the consultation period. So it's really I did focus on feedback earlier, but we want feedback, and we also want your questions. So if you don't have the question now or don't want to ask it during webinars, please email us.
Thank you, Noah. So we have another question about free riders. Is there a report confirming which free riders have been identified and incorporated into programs and budgets over the past year?
Yeah, that's a good question. We we have an ongoing initiative to improve our public reporting. both in terms of the performance reporting about the outcomes of the producer responsibility regulations, but also reporting on compliance activities. And I think as part of that reporting, we are now identifying or publishing information on the number of open compliance cases and the types of cases. Maybe we can, maybe Monica, if we have time, we can provide a link to our public reporting page on our website in response. If the information isn't there that you're looking for, maybe an email to us, and we can figure out if we do have it published somewhere, or if it is going to be if it's not already published, when it will be published in the future.
Thanks, Noah. And also, if anyone wants to just go online to our website and take a look at the public reporting documents for themselves, it's just once you land on our homepage, there are a few tabs along the right-hand side on the very top, and you'll see public reporting documents there. So you can also feel free to kind of poke around and see if you find what you need there. So the next question, Noah, is can you please provide more information on the decrease in registrants?
Yeah, so that's I think it depends on the program. So and I can give you part of an answer now. For lighting, the decrease I think really relates to better understanding of the number of producers in the program, and how much material and how many producers are obligated by the program. So lighting was a totally new program for us in 2022. And we had to make some assumptions about, and by totally new, I mean also that there was no legacy waste diversion program that we were transitioning over. So we did have to make a number of assumptions about number of producers that were out there, and those assumptions we now think were too high. So again, like I was trying to say before, we do try to estimate the number of producers that should be in the program, but we have revised that down for lighting substantially. I think it's a similar, it's a maybe a similar case with ITT, AV, and batteries. Although those programs, or that program has been operating for a number of years, the compliance team has revised down its estimate for the number of producers it thinks are obligated under the program. Again, it makes that estimate based on their understanding of the market and who's obligated and how many folks are out there who should be reporting. It's based on their estimate that we've seen the decrease in batteries and ITT AV.
Thanks, Noah. Just had another question come in. So tire producers have raised some concerns about supply reporting with the recent amendments, which impacts the fees that they have to pay to RPRA. Will RPRA be providing more information around this?
So I'm not sure which amendments are being referred to. Maybe this question. I think we do want to make sure that tire producers have the info they need around supply reporting. I think this question maybe is something we might need to deal with through our consultations email, because I might need a bit more information from you to get you the answer you need.
Yeah. So Megan, if you wouldn't mind sharing a question with us through the consultations email, consultations@rpra.ca. Also on our website, there is a news release. So if you look under our latest news section, again, kind of under that top right-hand header section on our homepage, have a look at our latest news posts, and you can also filter it by program. So you filter it right down to tires. And there was a recent post that talked about the amendments and how producers are impacted. So you may find the answer there, but if not, definitely reach out to us and we can talk more specifics.
Thanks, Monica.
Anytime, Noah. All right, looks like that's all the questions for now. So like I said, if folks have more, please send them in and we'll try to get to them at the end of the webinar. But for now, let's dive back into it.
Okay, so let's get on to the next slide. And I think now we're getting into our fee model. So if we keep going to the next slide, the fee model we're proposing for 2024 is the same as for 2023. So that means a flat fee for small producers under a certain threshold, which we're proposing to be $90 for 2024. For all the other producers, it's a variable fee. So it's a per tire fee for tire producers. It's a per kilogram fee for producers in all the other programs. And again, part of the reason we use this model is because that a variable fee protects smaller producers from an excessive fee burden, and also ensures that RIPRA's costs are the same for every producer on a per product basis. So there's no advantage that one producer has over another on a per product basis. Next slide, please. We maybe just a bit more detail about the model for our producer responsibility programs. Well, you know what? I think all of this gets covered in our program specific slides. So why don't we get moving to the fee rates. And here's just a summary overview of where fee rates are going. But I think it's probably easiest just to get right into each of the programs, which I think are start on the next slide. So tires, we're looking at an overall fee rate increase of about 6%. So I think before we saw a total program cost recovery target that showed a 2% year-over-year increase. The difference between that and the 6% here is mostly because our estimate for tire supply volumes for 2024 is down from what it was in 2023. So the way this estimate is done is looking at what supply numbers were reported in previous years. And there has been a decrease in supply being reported over the past 2 years or so. And we expect that to continue, or to put another way, we don't expect that that trend will reverse. So we're estimating a reduction in reported volume for 2024. Next slide, please. This is just trying to show you a breakdown, sort of what are the components of that year-over-year increase. So in this case, it's really what I've already summarized. So some portion of it is year-over-year program cost increase. The biggest portion relates to the estimated supply volume decrease. Next slide, please. So here's just a final view of the cost recovery target for tires for the year with a comparison to 2023. So this repeats information you saw in earlier slides, but maybe presents it in a way that's a bit easier to see year-over-year changes just for tires. Again, you see the amortization amount in the first line, plus interest in the second line. Small direct costs we're predicting in 2024 that relate to registry procedures, our shared services, and then startup costs and reserve contribution, and then the total amount at the bottom. So the biggest component there is obviously our shared costs, which are increasing, I think roughly in line with our budget increase year over year. Next slide, please. So now we have ITT AV and batteries. So you see the substantial decrease here in the per kilogram rate for batteries and ITT AV. Again, that is a combination of the year-over-year decrease in the cost recovery target, plus which includes substantial surplus from 2022, I believe, and an upwards adjustment in supply volume we expect to be reported. Next slide, please. Here again is just a breakdown, sort of where that the changes in the fee are coming from, and so one chunk is the year-over-year cost allocation decrease, and then you can see the surplus, and then the supply volume decrease. Supply volume in the increase in the estimated supply volume, also contributing to the year-over-year change. Next slide, please. This is the same view that we saw for tires. Again, you can see here the decrease in shared costs, which is the biggest change, which again relates to a decrease in number of registrants. Although supply volumes going up, the number of registrants we're predicting is going down, and that's reflected in the allocation. Next slide, please. So final program is lighting. So the lighting fee rate change, the lighting fee rate is going up by a substantial amount. We saw in the earlier slides that the actual targeted cost recovery is going down a little bit by about 3%, which includes a substantial deficit from 2022. Without the deficit, the cost allocation is going down even more. Because our volume estimates for 2024 are much lower than they were for 2023. So we're predicting that there's much less supply or much less material obligated under the program than what we had initially predicted. That's leading to, on a per kilogram basis, an increase year over year. Next slide, please. So again, this shows a breakdown where the year-over-year increase is coming from, and most of that is because of the supply volume estimated decrease for 2024. So on just looking at the program cost recovery, there's a slight decrease year over year. So the total being recovered from producers is down, but on a per kilogram basis, because our estimated volumes are lower, there's a fee rate increase. Next slide, please. So this is, again, same pictures for the other programs. You can see here the reduction in row number 4, the reduction in shared costs being allocated to lighting. And that's because of the fewer registrants are driving less activity in the program overall. And so costs are going down. And again, in terms of the fee rate, that's offset in part by deficit recovery and the increase being mostly driven by an adjustment to our estimates about how much material is obligated in the province under that regulation. Next slide, please. I think we might be at the end. So again, we do want your feedback. The earlier you get it to us, the better. If you do have questions for us, please submit them to, if you have feedback for us, send them to the email. If you have questions, additional questions, or the answers I gave weren't, you want to ask more about the answers I gave during this webinar, you can send those questions to that email address and we will get back to you.
Thank you, Noah. So just really quickly before we get into the last question portion, which I don't believe we have any others. I know we do have the one outstanding question about the tires amendments. So if you wouldn't mind actually emailing that question in, I believe it was Megan. You can also email it to info@rpra.ca if you'd like. Either way, it'll get to us, but I'd just like to look into that for you. So anyway, with that said, I'm just going to quickly launch a poll. And just really quickly, just gonna get some of your feedback. It just helps us to improve our future sessions. So gonna keep that open for about a minute. And in the meantime, maybe that'll give folks a few minutes to, or a minute, I suppose, to send in any new questions as well. So just give it a little longer. Thanks everyone for your responses. Just going to give it another 30 seconds. All right, looks like we've got a fair number of responses. Thank you again, everyone, for participating. Appreciate that. So as we mentioned before, we did have a little more time allotted at the end for some questions, but it doesn't look like we've got any new ones in. So Noah, unless you had anything to add, I guess we can go ahead and wrap up today's session.
Yep, nothing from me, but again, if questions come up that you didn't want to ask here that come up later, please send them in.
Great. Thank you so much, and have a great afternoon, everyone.